Hi, I'm Jason King, Beirne Chair and Director for the Center for Catholic Studies here at St. Mary's University. We're here talking to Dr. Victor Carmona. He came to us as part of our McTaggart lecture series on the Catholic intellectual tradition, and he spoke on the future of Catholic higher education from a Hispanic perspective. We talked about immigration, studying ethics, working on the core curriculum. It was a delightful conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Beyond the Lecture.
Welcome, Victor. Thank you for coming here and being with us at St. Mary's University for the talk. I wanted to just begin and ask you how you got into theology. How did you end up being a theologian?
By accident.
Perfect. So let me tell you, that's the answer that the majority of people give.
Yeah, I didn't even know that you could be a lay Catholic theologian.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to give a talk at Notre Dame, some time ago. But I gave this talk, and after the talk, as part of a panel on the Church in Latin America, Tim Maravina approached and asked me if I was considering studying theology, and I said no, I don't want to be a priest.
And was this after college, but before
after college? Yeah,
Oh.
So I had been working for about 4 years at that time after college, but I had always been intrigued by these questions. I just never gave it any thought until Tim Maravina encouraged me to give it some thought, and the rest is history.
You were at Georgetown, studied in politics. How did you get interested in that? My undergrad was in math, so it's like you end up in bizarre places.
Yeah, so my undergrad was in foreign service, international politics and organizations. My desire at the time was to be a diplomat. I wanted to join the foreign service. But I had this RSCJ sister who was my professor.
The sisters got you.
The sisters got me. So she asked me if I was working on my thesis on migration, and I needed a philosophical framework to analyze some issues, and I hated all of them because they felt too abstract to me. And she asked me, well, what about Catholic social teaching?
Yeah.
And I'm like, what is that? And she's like, oh, you're going to a Catholic university and you don't know what Catholic social teaching is. So yeah, she taught me Catholic social teaching during office hours. And I decided after that to serve in the church for 2 years, helping migrants and refugees. And I just kept going.
Yeah. And then with that work, did that get you the talk at Notre Dame?
Yeah.
Got you there.
So I did that for 4 years with the Mexican Catholic Conference of Bishops, mostly on the policy side, but there are always theological, ethical questions. And when I was asked to go to Notre Dame, I was no longer working for them. So I'm like, hey, I can't speak for the bishops, but I'll gladly share my experience. And they said, yeah, sure, come on by. And it was part of Raíces y Alas, which is an event geared towards ministry, nurturing ministry among Hispanic communities. And it was a wonderful experience, just bridging the church in Latin America with Hispanic Catholics in the U.S. Yeah.
How did you like Notre Dame? My mother-in-law would ask, who is the quarterback?
I can't remember.
my mother-in-law wouldn't remember, but how did you like Notre Dame?
At first, it was tough. Actually, I thought I had made a mistake the first 6 months. It was culture shock. It was not very welcoming. At least I experienced it as not very welcoming at first. But slowly, it grew on me. I met Father Virgilio Elizondo there, and Father Gustavo Gutierrez, and Tim Matovina, and all of that community. Dan Grudy, just they nurtured community among the Latino students, including me, in such a way that eventually it became home. And actually, after I left South Bend, after living there for 8 years, I cried because I grew to love the community there. Yeah.
And then you made your way down to San Antonio at Oblate. How was that experience?
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Coming to Oblate in San Antonio was, I think of it as the Oblates and God hugging me. Like, it was this beautiful, affirming experience of my Latino Catholicism. I felt very much at home here. And I just found an acceptance and a welcoming and a celebratory spirit from the get-go that just was life-giving.
That's good. Yeah. And I remember us talking, but then you were there for a while, and now you're in San Diego.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that move a little bit?
Oh my gosh. So again, I cried after
That is a good thing, right? Like that's born of
was,
like deep love and affection.
It's a sense of loss for the beauty that was, and of opening to the beauty that is to come. So USD has been very welcoming. I was born there. I grew up in the region. So it's been a wonderful experience and opportunity to be able to give back to my community and to the church there in the region. And it's just been wonderful helping USD become a Hispanic serving institution that is also committed to its Catholic identity. I'm loving that.
Okay. Yeah, I remember it was a book called Lost in the Cosmos by Walker Percy, and it was called The Last Self-Help Book. But one of the lines in this, like, if something's not wrong with you, then something's really wrong with you. Like if you're not crying because you're leaving places, something's sort of wrong. Like, because if you don't build up those connections, those are there. That's a great journey. I'll ask you. You sort of hinted at sort of the two of your areas of concentration. So I'll ask you about the first one. Talk about your research on immigration and Catholic social teaching. So I know you talked about how you did the work and how to public policy, but talk about your research, how that grew, and what's your thoughts, how that thought has taken shape.
So the irony is that what got me to theology in general and moral theology in particular was precisely pastoral care of migrants and refugees, policy issues and questions. So very practical questions and concerns around the question of what is the meaning and what does it imply? Like what does the way that Catholics think about migration, what does that imply for the world? What does that imply for the way in which we organize our politics and our policies? So I've been working on that for many years now. But increasingly, the way that my thinking on migration has shifted is that I increasingly think of it relationally. So one of the critiques that Latino Catholicism raises to the way that we tend to think about migration more broadly is we tend to think of migrants in the U.S. as migrants and us, migrants and citizens. Like they're two separate populations that are unrelated with each other. And the insight from Catholic social thought and from Hispanic Catholicism is, no, actually, we're in relationship. It's heavily relational. So more and more my work conceives of migration and the questions that migrations raises from the perspective of being in relationship. So mixed status families, employees, workers, business owners, and so on, in such a way that it just cuts across community boundaries that we think are there when in reality they're not.
I was reading and having this conversation with someone it was a book on ostensibly about animal migration, but the part of the bigger point was that migration sort of in part of what it means to be a human being. We all sort of move around, and the issues become some of these artificial boundaries that then create these obstacles to things that are very natural and the relationships that you sort of have.
And beginning with love. I mean, it's undocumented immigrants and U.S. citizens fall in love all the time.
You wrote that essay for the volume that Julie Rubio and I did on sort of mixed status families, and that's always hit home. And when I have taught it, it's hit home too, because those boundaries sometimes cut at the very heart of these loving sort of relationships, and how your documents, right, can give you access or not access within the same family, and then also create anxiety. And even when you're trying to do everything by the book, that it's almost impossible. It's almost, I remember that description. The students will get this description of the process. It's almost Kafkaesque, where you're like, you're in this like morass of bureaucracy, and you're trying, and there's just no way to. You're in the wrong line now. You waited too long on this line.
Now you got to go to this other line.
You're like, but I started this line like 10 years ago.
I mean, that's where just doing theology and ethics in a way that is attentive to reality, in all kinds of ways, it's very powerful. When I teach this, for example, to my students in Catholic social thought, so the sister who was my professor, I think she would be happy hearing this, that sentence right there. But I actually have them fill out the forms.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I'm like, okay, here are the forms that you need to fill out.
Oh,
Okay, half of you, you're U.S. citizens. You're trying to, bring a fiance or an employee over from wherever. The other half of you, okay, you're asylum seekers and so on. And it's just the forms always it gets to them, because it's like you're on the side of asylum seekers. It's like they're having to relive very traumatic experiences to demonstrate that they are in fact true. And on the side of the U.S. citizens, we're trying to, sponsor a future spouse or an employee. The questions are very intrusive and personal, and almost in a way that's vice versa to our system. You're guilty until you prove yourself innocent. Yeah.
This is a minor example, but they have the real IDs now, and Pennsylvania was like delayed, and then they were hurrying to try to get this done. And you have to present all of your documents. And I had misplaced my Social Security card, which is like
just
a piece of
card.
paper. I'm like, how can this be so essential? I actually had a photocopy of it. And they're like, no, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And then you couldn't get in. Social Security office was closed, COVID hit, and the state of Pennsylvania didn't allow you to request it online. I'd have to live in a different state. And so it was this and everything is above board. And I was like, I can't negotiate this. And then eventually I found the card, and then everything was fine. But I'm like, all of that depended upon this little piece of paper that my dad gave me when it was like 18. He's like, don't lose this. I'm like,
or else.
Yeah. So and that's a small, sort of situation, and that you just get crushed in that bureaucracy. Sometimes it feels there.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, how have you found moral theology in dealing with that? I'm just thinking of sometimes the methods become abstract or theoretical, or in a way that doesn't seem to address the realities. Or have you found the tools helpful, or has it been kind of a mixed bag?
So let's say, I think it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I gave a paper at the Society of Christian Ethics, where I analyzed the programs from the previous 20 years to trace
of the Society.
Of the Society, to trace its conversations on migration. And going into the project, I was assuming that, come on, they're not really going to be involved. But I was surprised to find a relatively robust conversation from the early aughts. Yeah. And even some methodological shifts over time. And we're actually, as a society, I think we're in the midst of another shift.
Yeah.
That is, I think, more and more of us are starting to think of it relationally. But a meaningful shift in the work that we do as a discipline has been being more attentive to the experience and the voices of migrants themselves. So, for example, increasingly we're also having scholars, Catholic scholars, many of them theologians, some of whom also do ethics, like Leo Guardado, who are themselves immigrants. So it's just bringing a robust conversation to the field that is serving our students well, it's serving our research well, and I think eventually it can also serve many decision makers in the church and elsewhere, pretty well into the future.
Good. My sense is that it's also become a conversation that's more pervasive in the field. I feel like, especially in my grad school days, this was not if it was on a syllabus, it was kind of at the end under sort of special topics. Yeah. And so you might have hit it other way, but now it seems much more part and parcel. If you're not attentive to these voices when you're doing it, there's a question, and you're sort of
something's missing in your method. Yeah, I mean, even at Notre Dame, at first, even though what brought me to Notre Dame was a desire to think through the experiences of migrants and refugees and the policy questions that they were raising, and the pastoral difficulties that the bishops and other pastoral leaders were dealing with, were raising. At times, there was a concern that it was too pastoral a concern, or it wasn't theoretically rich enough. And looking back, I understand why they raised. Some of my faculty, my professors raised that concern, especially now that I'm teaching. I get it, but at the same time, we're no longer dealing with those questions. So for me, it suggests that the field has moved on to the point that now we treat migration broadly, and the methodological developments that we've been undertaking, it treats them as a given now. And that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder sometimes if the field, I'm thinking, coming out of Vatican II with this almost an insecurity as an academic field, wanting to establish itself as academic, tends to push that and be suspicious of spirituality or pastoral ministry, and creates these sort of divides. Oh, we're not in the confessional anymore. And that, but that insecurity seems less so now. I don't feel like that's the conversation in many ways. And so that becomes freer because you don't have those artificial boundaries.
And I think it becomes truer, much more grounded in reality. I think part of that is because Vatican II. I also think part of it is actually the increasing number of Latinos and Latinas and Latinx in the field. Because what Vatican II and the Iberian strand of Catholicism does is that we offer an integral view of faith, where spirituality gives way to theological reflection and ethical claims. You can't have one without the other. One of the scholars here at Ovid, Philip Sheldrake, I remember this conversation once with him, and he's like, Victor, I think spirituality has a moral edge. And I agreed wholeheartedly with him, which is why I loved teaching there. And then from my disciplinary perspective, I'm like, and ethics has a spiritual heart. So I think we're becoming much more attuned to that aspect of our discipline. And I think it's a good thing.
I remember back to my grad school days, because they were pushing me to one of your subspecialties. If you're doing ethics, one of your subspecialties should be spirituality. And at the time I was like, whatever.
Why?
I'm really smart now. What are you telling me to do? Like you see the wisdom in the reverse, but that connection.
And students want it. Even so, one of the blessings of being at Oblate for 5 years was that I got seeped with conversations around spirituality, including the academic study of spirituality. Participated in several projects, as like PhD projects. I would be one of the readers and so on. Helped one of the cohorts at the end with their final project, and what that gave me was just this appreciation for just the interest that younger colleagues have. And I'm seeing it at USD, for example. I'm sure you might be seeing something like this here, where we're offering more and more courses on spirituality, even as a gateway to study theology, because students are intrigued by it. So when we start presenting theology and ethics as being what comes naturally from having a strong spirituality, students are game. And then they ask really interesting questions, pushing boundaries.
It's interesting because it touches on my ongoing thinking about handing on the Catholic intellectual tradition. I always feel like I need to qualify that. Not in terms of like, oh, you need to carry this forward and it's this thing that's really important, but like it was life-giving to me and want to share life-giving things with other individuals. But when you have a culture and peoples that are suspicious of institutions, many times rightfully so, then it's hard to sort of tap into those sources. And so how do you speak to that need for nourishment and meaning and purpose without those kind of networks? And spirituality may be sort of a way into that, or
I think it is
speaking to those.
I also
first.
I affirm the importance of spirituality both pastorally and theoretically or academically, because it puts things in perspective, including religion itself. So, for example, when I explain the relationship between spirituality and religion, I do this because I have many students who self-identify as spiritual but not religious. So then we have an interesting conversation about, well, what is religion for you? What does it mean? What is it about? And even though my colleagues in religious studies constantly remind me that there's no agreed upon definition of religion.
Yeah.
You know, something that from an intellectual humility perspective, I'm deeply grateful for. At the same time, though, I think it's like plumbing.
Yeah.
So spirituality is the water, religion is plumbing. It's and sometimes we have some folks, even in the Catholic Church, who are so hung up on the plumbing that we might end up with beautiful plumbing, but it's not carrying water. And it's like, do you remember why we're doing this to begin with? It's like we're supposed to,
Yes.
So we're meant to carry the water of the gospel from point A to point B, especially when you're running dry, you know.
The purpose is not the plumbing.
There you go. The purpose is not the plumbing. But so my students always love that because it makes sense to them, and what they sense is wrong with religion, especially, you know, including in our church. But then I also invite them to be mindful. Okay, right now you're young.
Yeah.
You're on fire. You also have a very clear sense of where the water lies right now. But eventually life will happen and you will run dry. At that point, that's when I hope you turn to plumbing. At that point, I hope you turn to religion. You know, those of you who self-identify as Catholic, you know, including Catholicism. So I'm hoping that there's that openness, even though as we acknowledge, I think we need to acknowledge that in the Catholic Church, many bishops and theologians at times, we forget that it's plumbing.
Yeah.
It's plumbing.
Yeah. It's supposed to be help to provide a service.
There you go.
This helps me transition to my next question, since you brought up students and teaching and plumbing. You're also director of the core curriculum.
Yeah.
So speak a little bit about your concern for education's core, that the ways in which that is sort of nourishing. And, you know, there's a value to the professional education that gets people jobs, but there's a bigger mission there, which is usually associated with the core curriculum.
Yeah, so
because you described the core curriculum as director as being a plumber.
Yeah, that too. We make sure that the plumbing's working.
Yes.
Hopefully most of the time, and that it serves students, right, and their needs.
Exactly.
So I mean, I think at Catholic universities, it's absolutely essential for us to remain committed to two things: the liberal arts and the Catholic intellectual tradition. In terms of the liberal arts, for example, at USD, you know, we have certain requirements for explorations. And the idea there is that students, regardless of what they're going to end up choosing as their majors, you know, we need to be open to the insights of the liberal arts in general and the humanities in particular, because they remind us that there's more to life than being, you know, and I'm not saying it's not important to have a job and like jobs. I mean, Catholic social teaching, right?
Dignity of work.
It's important. There you go. It's important, but it's not the only thing that defines us as human beings. So it puts things in perspective. So liberal arts and the humanities are, I think, it's something that Catholic universities must remain committed to nurturing, and we must resist the temptation to attempt to justify the value of the humanities based on a return on investment. I think return on investment is a serious, you know, it's an important metric, but it shouldn't be the only one, and it shouldn't be it should definitely not be the one that has us weaken our commitment to the humanities. I think that's a dangerous road to tread.
Yeah.
And then on the Catholic intellectual tradition side, commitment to foundations. It's foundational in Catholic universities. That includes a commitment to courses in theology and religious studies. It includes commitment to courses in philosophy and ethics. You know, and that's something that I think Catholic universities must continue to nurture, so that our students and alumni in turn can nurture broader society, especially with all the polarization that we're struggling through right now.
In a previous interview, I was asking my interviewee, who is a philosopher at a state school, and ask her about the future, and she's like, "Oh, I'm not going to worry till Catholic schools start getting rid of their philosophy departments." And that was her sense that she was aware that state schools have sometimes different priorities, even though she felt it was important. But the Catholic schools, if they started giving up on it, the conversation was going badly.
Yeah, that's when you worry.
Yeah.
You know, one of the critiques from a theological standpoint of the way we do things in this country, is that we have this tendency to rely on and use economic principles and frameworks as the final, criteria to determine the future of a program. Sometimes we also do that with legal frameworks and questions and so on. And again, as important as those are, the claim from the Catholic intellectual tradition will be perspective. We need to consider those, but we need to place them in their proper perspective.
It's not the either or, like you have
Correct.
to choose those things, but situating them in this broader view of sort of life. The work is important, but you're not reduced down to your work. You're not evaluated by your productivity. There's meaning. There's meaning there.
Yeah, I mean, it's and I think that's a beautiful insight that we offer broader society, and it's life-giving. And I think Catholic universities need to continue nurturing that in U.S. society for us to flourish.
I think it's been a perpetual struggle for Catholic higher ed. They've always kind of been committed to that, and then always struggled to pay the bills. And then you open law schools, business schools, which are very good, and they doing good sort of work, but then they create the money. And so how do you sort of support those, sustain those, but without giving up on this sort of broader mission and value them, but also value those other things? And it's like reading the history. You're like, oh, this is hard.
But this is where I think theology and ethics, offer practical reasoning, right? This is where we must appreciate the importance of practical reasoning, even in terms of how we train our business students and our law students and so on. It's my business school students get a kick out of this, because I constantly remind them businesses are part and parcel of furthering the common good. They have a role to play, not the only role to play, right? Not the only ones and so on, but they have a role to play, a key role to play in furthering the common good of a society beyond just creating wealth.
I used to teach this course called God, Work, and Money, and I designed it because it was by the end of the 4 years at a Catholic school, a lot of these students hadn't spent time thinking about the major or the job that they sort of wanted. And when I wanted to create space for them, but part of this was also to remind business majors oftentimes that you could do good work here, and they really wanted to. When I asked them what you wanted to do and why you wanted to do it, they would have these visions of the work that they would do, how they would treat the workers, how they would run a business, the value of all of those sort of the goods that they would produce, because they didn't want to go in and there was a moment do you remember when fidget spinners were really popular and they were cranking them out, and they were I had a student I don't want to run a business that just makes fidget spinners all the time.
As fun as they are.
Yeah, as fun as they are. Nothing against that business, but he wanted something meaningful, and finding that in the business, and they just didn't have either the language or the time or the opportunity to just put those things in, and that seems to be.
See, that's what I think the Catholic intellectual tradition offers. It offers a formative outlook. So we form our students, we nurture and help them become, hopefully, the people who God calls them to be. So we nurture them that way. But we also give them language. We give them a way to articulate. We give a way to imagine, what the world could be like, what their lives could be like. And one of my favorite definitions of prayer is actually dreaming in vision with God, or dreaming with God's visions. And I'm like, that's beautiful. That's what many of our students are also pursuing in their own ways, in meaningful ways. And I think part of what we do as Catholic universities is we tell them that's valid, that's legitimate, that's important. Keep at it. Don't let go.
Yeah, you can. The skill of being able to imagine things being differently.
Oof.
Yeah, that's hard to do.
Increasingly so.
Yeah.
And here, I have 2 teenage daughters, And here I understand why many times parents are worried or concerned when their college-age students start taking courses in theology and philosophy and ethics and the humanities more broadly and the liberal arts and so on. You know, how is that going to make you employable? And I understand that concern, but the wisdom of the tradition is that will help them be good people. You know, that will help them have not just good careers, but good lives. And I think this is essential for Catholic universities in the U.S. to maintain. And, you know, this is one of the important reasons to withstand pressures to think about every decision or most decisions through simply or exclusively an economic lens.
That's good. That sets up beautifully my last question, which is, tell me the future of Catholic higher education. Where do you think it's going? My setup is, I think the ground's changing, right? The higher ed's changing. Yeah. It's demographic pieces, economic model pieces, a whole bunch of things are sort of changing. Technology is shaping it, and so it's going to look different. And you preserve some things, and you change other things. But within that, then Catholic higher education has certain missions, and so I'm trying to, for my own sake, trying to figure out what this sort of looks like. What do you think? What, if you could imagine a Catholic higher education that would flourish and do the things that we hope it would do?
This is where
we'll come back in a few years and I'll break your answer.
It's like, did this happen or not? This is where I appreciate Pope Francis's challenge to remember that structures and institutions are meant to serve something bigger than they are. And in our case, it's, you know, the intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. It's a particular way of knowing and seeing the world and serving God through that world and our neighbors in that world. And I think Catholic universities will continue doing that. I trust that we will. But the structures that we use to that end will very likely, you know, look different than they do now. I think they will maintain a commitment to the humanities and the liberal arts. I think that will remain. However, it will look somewhat differently. The size and shape and timing of universities might be different. I'll give you a quick example.
Good.
I've always been intrigued by this assumption that higher education has to happen at a single go during 4 years.
18 to 21.
18 to 21, boom, that's it. It hasn't always been like that in the history of the church, and it need not be like that in the future either. I think increasingly we're going to be seeing more of our students throughout their life. I think Catholic universities need to re-envision their calling and their mission as going beyond those 4 years. So that's number one. So we're going to see more certificates, more, you know, just more fluid programs, I think. And I believe that's a good thing. And then secondly, I think we need to be open to losing the fear of our changing student body, our student population. Most students in U.S. universities in this country have tended to be European American. And yes, I understand that there is a demographic cliff for that particular student population.
I always like how they call the demographic cliff. The students we're losing students, but it's a demographic cliff for a specific demographic.
It's a very specific demographic. And so it's like, you know, keep heart, you know, the students, you know, we need to be hopeful. We will continue having students. Actually, I think we might end up having more students if we have this more expansive view of the mission of Catholic higher education. I think we'll remain committed to that, but that entails letting go of certain notions, letting go of certain preconceptions, and just trust in the wisdom of the tradition, trust in the wisdom of the community, and trust our students who are coming.
I often think about this. My dad later in his life became involved with the Knights of Columbus, which is a men's group, but they were like 60-year-old, 50-year-old guys sat around, and they did a lot of sort of good work, but they were hungry for knowledge, and there was no easy way. Like they didn't want to pay thousands of dollars for a master's degree, nor did they want that that kind of level of certification, but they did want knowledge and deepening and understanding and finding a way to address that constituency in 40-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds. Yeah, it does. When you think about that structure of compressing it into 18 to 21, and then now you're done.
Yeah,
it's just nuts.
I don't think that's how it works, and I don't think that's how it must work either. I think we can be creative. I think we can have vision, and again, just trust.
That's a great note to end on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.